All right, let's try this one last time. So we ended on the Tet Offensive, I hope. It's right here on the back. So if you flip that page, I wrote Tet Offensive again. 70,000 communist soldiers were captured. And then they also seized part of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. So the Tet Offensive is just going to add to major distrust that's happening within this government, because Americans no longer feel that this war was being won. They were being lied to this whole time, saying, we're winning the war, we're winning the war. But when you're watching this on TV, because this is the first war that was ever filmed, they realize, well, we're not really winning the war. And why did this happen if we won the war? Why was the U.S. Embassy taken over? So again, this is a rude awakening for many Americans that this was a war that was not winnable, that we were not going to be able to win. So again, major distrust in the government. Nixon in Vietnam. Nixon is the president to end the war. He is the president to end the war with the United States involvement in the war in Vietnam. Okay, so he had something called Vietnamization. This is basically pulling the U.S. troops out and leaving the Vietnamese to do the fighting. So we pulled these troops out and put the fighting into the hands of the South Vietnamese. This is going to pull the United States troop and our involvement out of this war. So the U.S. withdrew in 1975 from Vietnam. The North eventually overran the South. So, of course, we were unsuccessful in this war of containing communism because now Vietnam was one country that was all communist. We lost about 58,000 troops and 3,000 people were wounded. And we spent $150 billion on this unwinnable war. So Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, they all fell to communism. So that domino theory, if one fell, they would all fall, did happen. So let's talk about some of the protesting that happened and some of the people that were against this war, because not everybody was for the Vietnam War. So we call that the counterculture. The counterculture are the group of people that were known as the baby boomers that were against fighting in Vietnam, right? They're the ones that didn't go along with just what the government says. They were the people that were in colleges that questioned the government and what they did. So they were against the fighting in Vietnam. So that how did they show this? They showed it through protesting. There was also music that was vivid protests as well. And they were known usually as the hippies. So, Kent State and Jackson State incidents, this happened in 1973. They were protesting the Vietnam War, and these were on these college campuses. The Kent and Jackson State universities were sites of these protests, and students were killed. There was violence. People were killed, and, there was violence within our own country over a war that was being fought foreign. So, again, not everybody agreed with this, but these violent, for these protests, though, they had now become violent, and people were getting killed within our own country because they were against this war. Agent Orange, this was a chemical spray used by the United States on the jungles of Vietnam. So really it was to kill all the trees, all the plants, all the vegetation, so that we could locate the enemy. It was the deforestation of the trees, right? Well, the problem is that it was very, very dangerous, and it was found that Agent Orange was harmful to humans, and it infected our troops and made a lot of them very sick and long-term problems. And in 1948, manufacturers had to agree to pay these veterans that were injured by this chemical, and they had to pay them. So, with that being said, what's the legacy of Vietnam? Well, 26th Amendment was created. This lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. So now you only had to be 18 years to vote because of the 26th Amendment. Because the issue was that people were being drafted at 18 to fight a war, but they could not vote. So that was an issue. Another thing that came out of this later was the War Powers Act. This was an act or a law that was passed by Congress. This is now done to limit the president's war-making powers. This goes back to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That Gulf of Tonkin Resolution where they gave the president a blank check to do whatever he wanted without a declaration of war. So, when you do that, right, it came with consequences. We had an extremely long war. Now they said, nope, we're Xing that out. You no longer, as an executive branch, get that ability to do it. You can only have 90 days of fighting within a country, right? Until you have to have a declaration of war. So Congress has to do it. So again, it gets us back to our checks and balances that they did not have during that Vietnam War and that Gulf of Tonkin resolution. You can flip that page. All right, let's talk about the presidents. President Nixon. President Nixon was the first president. All right. He was going to be impeached. Right? He was going to be impeached, but he resigned. So he stepped down before he got removed, because he was a president that was going to be removed. So he resigned and stepped down. All right? And his vice president took over. And the reason why is the vice president now becomes president. And what he does is he pardons Nixon. And when I say he pardons Nixon, that means now Nixon cannot be held responsible for any of the issues that he had in that Watergate scandal, right? The whole issue was the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal was when they bugged the Democratic National Convention office, right? And they put those bugs in there so they could hear what was happening, completely illegal. It all led back to Nixon. And Nixon had taped his recordings in his office. So they asked him for his recordings. He said no. He claimed presidential executive privilege and for the good of the nation. Yeah, that got denied pretty quickly in the case of the United States versus Nixon. So he knew not only was he going to be impeached, but he would be the first president to be removed, because no president has been removed that he really committed a crime. Okay, so he was known for that Vietnamization, removing United States troops from South Vietnam. He was the first president to visit China. He had that foreign policy of détente. Détente was that relaxation that was happening during that Cold War. All right, trying to ease these Cold War tensions. Agnew Shapiro, his resignation. Oh, okay, so this is talking about, so not only did Nixon get impeached, this is the greatest part about it. So, okay, so Nixon doesn't technically get impeached. He resigns before. But this is Nixon's original vice president, Agnew Shapiro, right here, okay? The problem is Agnew Shapiro does some illegal stuff himself and gets himself with charging for income tax evasion, right, and accepting bribes. So he has to step down as vice president. Okay? So he has to step down as vice president. So what happens is that Nixon now has to find a new vice president because he was guilty of that. And so then he gets a new vice president, which turns out to be, I think, Gerald Ford. Okay? So the Committee for Re-election, we're not worried about that. This is that Watergate scandal where he paid people to spy on the Democratic Party, right? And this was that Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal exposed the connection between the White House and the Watergate burglars. Let's see here. So it leads to the court case. Nixon versus the United States. This is where Nixon is going to lose that court case because he says he refuses to turn over Watergate tape saying executive privilege, that it's the good of the country. and the safety of the country, that he is to not allow anybody to see on that tape. However, then the court tells him he's got to turn over the tapes. He had abused his power, and they're drawing up impeachment charges. So Nixon resigns, and Ford steps in and pardons him. So let's talk about this, right? He pardons him. He excuses him of being charged with a crime. So he will not be charged with that crime because his vice president, who becomes president, pardons him. Okay? So Ford, President Ford, he is the only president that was actually not elected to either presidency or vice presidency. Remember, Nixon had Agnew Shapiro, who was his vice president, but the vice president, of course, does some illegal stuff and has to step down. So Ford becomes the vice president for Nixon. Well, then Nixon does some shady ass shit, and now Ford becomes president. Whoopsie. So, what was the legacy of the Watergate scandal? It shows that checks and balances works and that nobody is above the law, including the president. 25th Amendment details the procedure where the vice president was to take over the presidency. Don't worry about that one. 26th Amendment, that one we know, that was the one that lowers the voting age to 18 years old. We already talked about now, that's the National Women's Organization of Equal Rights Amendment. Yep, we already did that. Roe v. Wade, this was the Supreme Court ruled that every woman had the legal right to end their pregnancy. That was overturned just recently, though, and put back into the hands of the states.